Hey everyone. I am waiting to see who joins us before we actually get started. So I don't see anyone yet. So I'll sit here for a minute and wait and see who jumps on. But this is indeed the beginning of our Sunday school on Galatians. And this is a class that I've been teaching in my foundations class. I think we started it in late January, early February. Oh, hey, Rachel. Hey, Tommy. And this is a little odder than Zoom because I can't interact. So we may see about setting up a church Zoom account, which I think might give us a better Sunday school experience, but we'll do this for right now. I can see if you put in questions and send them out. I can see that. So anyway, just to let you know, hi Brad, hi Robin. Let me know if you can hear me okay. And one of the things I'm also going to do is I'm going to share my computer screen with you so that you can see some slides. So I will do that. And if you want, I can make, yes, I think Zoom is definitely easier for discussion. The problem, what we were concerned about was if everyone would have access to it or be able to get the invitation. So Jeb and I are still talking about that, but I'm hoping we can actually move to a Zoom format simply so that we can actually look at each other and talk with each other. So I'm hoping we can do that. Robin, Brad, have y'all used Zoom? Do you know what that is? Would you have access or be able to do that if I sent you a Zoom invitation? Or if you don't know what it is, that's fine too. But anyway, that's something you can let me know. But I will be sharing my computer screen slide with you, and I can post the entire PowerPoint afterwards, so you don't have to worry about trying to write everything down. But please feel free to send in questions so that I don't feel like it's just a monologue here, which is the way that it feels right now. But anyway, thank you very much. Okay, Brad, you're not sure about Zoom. I'll see. Jeb and I will talk about it. We were talking about getting a church account for it so that we can do more things like this. So we'll look at that a bit more seriously this week and see if we can get that set up. The nice thing about Zoom is we can all actually look at each other while we're doing it. And then actually you can voice questions directly to me. So we'll see. But I can see all the comments you're posting right now, so feel free to keep doing this. We'll see if anybody else joins us for a minute before we actually get started. And I'll tell you what, while we're waiting to see if anybody else joins us, I'll turn my screen and make sure y'all can see my PowerPoint slide okay. So let me know if you can't see it when I turn. Does that work? Can you still hear me when I turn my screen like that? Maybe. I'm assuming so. Nobody's told me they can't see it or can't hear me. Hi, Jamie. How are y'all? So I will go ahead. It's fairly hard to see. That's what Rachel said. Okay. Well, I have some maps, so it may be better to see with the maps, and I'll be talking through what I show with this, and we'll figure it out. We'll see. Maybe I can get Jeb to post the PowerPoint in advance on the Facebook page, so that could be helpful too. So welcome to our conversation about Galatians. And for those of you who are new, to maybe studying the book of the Bible this way. This is the way that I prefer to do my Sunday schools and my own personal Bible study. And that is placing the books of the Bible within some historical context. And so understanding what is going on from the time of the people who were actually living, that the books were written to directly. And then at that point, when we understand why the books were written and we understand who their audience was and we understand what the original intent of their audience was, then talking about what they say to us today and what they mean for Christians today. So this is an inductive Bible study approach, as well as obviously the historical context, and that's the part that I really like too. So I will be talking a little bit more about what is going on in history with this, and if you ever get bored or if you have questions, if I don't cover all of the questions, then you can feel free to type those in and I will help you with that. So is everyone ready? Are there any questions before we get this kicked off tonight in this sort of odd format? Is everyone good? I think there's a slight delay in what I get texted to me here. So, but I'm keeping my eye on it, so it's good. Okay, well, let's start off then with Galatians. So as I said, all you need is just to turn your Bible to Galatians and get started with it. And today we're not going to cover very much of the text. We're actually just going to talk a little bit about the context and where it comes from. But I do want to start off with the very introduction of Galatians, because it tells us some important things in order to get started with it. And so I'm reading from the NRSV translation, the New Revised Standard Version, but you can follow along within whatever version you have. And if your version has some differences that you find confusing and you want to ask about, you can feel free to text those in and I'll take a stab at trying to answer them too. So I'm just going to start off with just the first few verses here, okay? So we're just going to read verses 1 through 5, okay? So it says, Paul, an apostle, sent neither by human commission nor from human authorities, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the members of God's family who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to set us free from the present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Okay. So this is a letter. That introduction tells us that this is a letter that Paul is writing. It also tells us that Paul is considered at this point to be an apostle, and that is the authority that he is claiming. We're going to talk a little bit more next week about what it means to be an apostle. But it says that Paul is claiming the authority of the apostle. And it also tells us that there are churches that have been established outside of Jerusalem, outside of Israel, and in places in other parts of the Roman Empire, Galatia. Okay, Galatia is far removed from Jerusalem. It is not a Jewish city. It is not a Jewish state. It is a Gentile state. So it tells us that the gospel has already spread out beyond the bounds of Jerusalem and is out moving into the Roman Empire and has established churches. Now, when we say established churches, we're not talking about what we think about. You know, right now we're very conscious of missing our church buildings, of our pews and our sanctuaries and our steeples and our windows. The early church didn't have places like that. They met mostly in homes. They were house churches. And so when they talk about these established churches, they're talking about these established communities of believers that were already fairly organized and already had leaders of these house churches. So this is who Paul is writing to. And we know from this salutation that he is already an authority figure in the early church, and that there already are established Christian churches beyond the realm of the Roman Empire. So are there any questions, or did that bring up anything that people want to talk about before? I'm going to show you a map here in just a minute. Okay. Hi, Victoria. How are you? So let's start then by talking about the historical context of Galatia. And so I'm showing you a map here of the Roman Empire that I think is probably a little bit easier to see than the text. You can also see my kitchen back there behind it. But this is the Roman Empire in the first century, and it's pretty large. It extends throughout the entire perimeter of the Mediterranean Sea. And you can also see, if you can see my finger, okay, this is where Israel, whoops, I can't do this. This is Israel. This is the Jewish world right here. And this area right here, this red part, this is Galatia that we see right here in the red. And this area is actually Anatolia. It's the ancient word for it was the Anatolian Peninsula. It is now modern day Turkey. Okay, so Galatia is in modern day Turkey. is where we would see it now today. And so you can see it is quite a distance from the Jewish world, okay? And in fact, I'll show you a map in a minute. Are there any questions about that? Is anyone confused? So this is Galatia. First century of the Common Era, or first century AD, is when this takes place. And it is kind of odd because I can't see y'all's facial expressions. So if anybody needs me to stop or do something, just wave your hand. Or if you get bored, you can send me a sleepy face and I'll try to do something different. I can't tell, as I can usually tell with students if they're falling asleep in class. So Galatia is in the Roman province of the first century. It actually has been part of Rome for quite a while. It was conquered by the Roman Empire in the second century. It was a second century BC, so before the Common Era. It actually was populated by a group of people that we know more from England and Ireland. They're a group of people called the Celts, and they lived in this area. They worshipped they had pretty standard pagan worship practices. They worshiped a sky god whose name I can't remember right now, but I remember his consort was a female goddess named Sybil. So fairly standard pagan Roman Empire practices. They were conquered in the second century by the Roman Empire, and they actually were brought into full Roman citizenship under the Emperor Augustus, Caesar Augustus. So around 25 BCE, before the Common Era, they were brought in as full Roman citizens. Okay, so this is the area that we're talking about. Any questions? Anything with that? Okay. Well, then let's talk about the Roman Empire itself. And this is often a lot of fun. I think it's important when we talk about Paul and we talk about the early church that we remember the context in which they are living every day. And they were not living in an especially friendly they were not living in a friendly historical context. And in fact, during Paul's lifetime, the Christianity is going to start facing more persecutions. Now, I say that sort of hesitatingly because while Christians were persecuted in the early Roman Empire, they are not persecuted nearly as much as they are going to be in the third century. So first century persecutions against Christians are not nearly as bad as they're going to be in the third century. All Christian persecutions are mostly what we call localized. They mostly happen in particular areas. Jerusalem is always a hot spot for them. And they are usually only for specific periods of time, like 10 to 20 years, usually because somebody got upset about something in particular, or because a Roman emperor is trying to clamp down on things. So they're not widespread all the time. There are many years within the early part of Christianity in which many Christians would never face persecution, but then there are some times when it gets really, really bad. Okay, and so it's actually one of the first times that persecution gets bad for Christians happens during Paul's lifetime, and it happens because of a particular Roman emperor. So is everyone still with me? As I said, this is kind of odd for me not being able to see y'all. So I'm going to show you another very convoluted slide here, and I'll post it onto our Facebook page so that you can see it if you want to see it. But it's what we call the Julio-Claudian family tree. Okay, and let me tell you what that is. These are some of the early emperors, and I know you're not going to be able to see all of the details on here. I'm going to point out some things for you, and I'll post it for you. But these are the early emperors of Rome. And it starts with the first emperor. If you know anything about the Roman history, you can divide it up into roughly it's 1,000 years, roughly 500 BC to 500 AD. It doesn't exactly last that long, but we can kind of pretend that's sort of it. It gives us nice, clean parameters. But 476 is when the last Roman emperor is defeated in the Common Era, so we don't quite make it to 500. But roughly the first 500 years of the Roman emperor of Rome, it is a republic. Okay, the second half of the Roman Empire, it is indeed a true empire. And it starts, the very first Roman emperor of Rome is a guy named Caesar Augustus, okay? And Caesar Augustus is sort of the beginning of what we call the Julio-Claudian family tree. And in fact, if you see right here, you see a guy whose name you probably all know. His name is Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is he adopts a guy named Octavius Augustus. And Octavius Augustus becomes really the first Roman emperor, okay? And Octavius Augustus is not directly related to, well, he sort of is, but is not, Rome had a habit of adopting people into their families. There's a long history of this. It has a lot of political background to it. But essentially the emperors following Caesar Augustus are a guy named Tiberius, a guy named Caligula, a guy named Claudius, and a guy named Nero. Okay, is everybody with me? So I really just want you to see the names. We have Caesar Augustus, we have Tiberius, we have Caligula, we have Claudius, and we have Nero. Everyone with me? Okay. Maybe you've gone to sleep. We'll see. I could spend a whole lot of time telling you all sorts of horrific and fascinating stories about these people. Let's just say none of them are really good emperors, okay? Tiberius is probably his best when he's ignoring everyone, but that still doesn't go very well. Caligula literally is crazy. There's no other explanation for it. Something happens to him. We're not exactly sure. We think he has a mental breakdown as a teenager, and he never recovers from it. He does crazy things, like he really thinks he's a god. He thinks he can deliver prophecies. He thinks he sees visions. He sees things that aren't really there. He thinks he can talk to his horse. He puts his horse on the Senate. Nobody knows if that's a joke or if he really thought the horse should be on the Senate. We don't really know. Caligula's crazy. He ends up getting murdered by his guards, who put his uncle, a guy named Claudius, on the throne. Claudius is a good emperor, actually. He is not crazy. He's very smart, but he suffered from polio as a child. Haha. Hey, Rachel. Rachel just asked a really good question. So if you'll let me stop for a minute. She said, and I'll flip the screen over. She said, don't all Roman emperors claim to be a deity? Sort of. This actually began with Julius Caesar. After the death of Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus began to pay homage to him and actually had a temple erected for him, where he was given sort of semi-divine status with the Roman gods. And so part of this is what Rome functioned in what we call a patronage system. And this is going to get real. Tell me if this is more than you want to know. But essentially, the way that you moved up in Roman society was by having powerful friends who you gave them something. You gave them military service. You gave them your family loyalty. Kind of think about The Godfather. The Godfather system, if you think about the movie The Godfather, it kind of fits Roman patronage a little bit. Not always so lethal, but sometimes it is. The idea is that if you paid homage to a powerful person like a Roman emperor, that could get you in with the gods, with the Roman gods, especially the ones that Roman emperor served. And in fact, over time, those Roman emperors were considered to be semi-divine. It usually didn't happen till after they died, though, okay? So yes, Rachel, they were, but it's after they died, and it's usually temples that are erected to them that are also erected to the larger god, who sort of is the major patron of that Roman emperor. Does that make sense? So what happens with Caligula is Caligula claims to be a living god, which makes him a little bit different from what has gone before. Okay, so he's literally crazy. He literally thinks he's a god. He sort of has very much a narcissistic personality. And so he gets murdered by the Praetorian guards. I'll go back to my family tree here. So if we go back, he gets murdered by the Praetorian guards. And Rachel, you can let me know if I didn't answer your question. But he gets murdered by him, and they put his uncle, Caligula's uncle, gets put on the throne, and his name is Claudius. The story is that the Praetorian guards find Claudius literally hiding behind a curtain because he's so afraid that he's going to get killed. Claudius suffered from polio as a child, and he limped. And he drooled and he stuttered. And oh, good. I'm glad I answered your question, Rachel. Janie, welcome. I'm in sort of the middle of it. So if you have questions or you want me to get caught up, we're talking about the historical context of Galatians. And so we're talking about the Roman emperors here. So Claudius gets put on the throne. He suffered from polio as a child, limped, drooled, stuttered. But he was very smart. But he actually did a lot of good things for Rome. Out of all of the emperors, out of all of these Julio-Claudian emperors, he's actually the best one. But, and I'll turn it back to me for a little bit, but he doesn't have very good taste in his wives. And you can imagine that he doesn't have a lot of physical attractions himself. So the women who marry him tend to marry him for political gain, what they can get from it. And this definitely is the case of his fourth wife. The fourth wife he marries is a woman named Agrippina. And Agrippina has political motivations for her son. And her son is a guy named Nero. Okay, and so here's Nero right down here, and we can see Nero rules from 41 to 54 Claudius rules from 41 to 54 AD, and then Nero rules from 54 to 68. So this is my point of all of this, of talking about all of that, is that when Paul is writing Galatians, the emperor in Rome is Claudius moving to Nero. And it is under the reign of Nero that the first systematic persecutions against the Christians began. It also seems to be during the reign of Nero. Nero rules from 54 AD to 68 AD. And it is during Nero's reign that we begin to see Christians being differentiated from Jews for the first time. And these are not, and we're talking about historical records outside of the Bible. So what we begin to see is a few things written where they talk about a cult of the Jews, and this is especially true during the reign of Nero. They talk about a cult of Jews who follow Christus. Okay, and so we see this differentiation where the Romans, looking from the outside at Christianity, differentiate it from the Jewish people and recognize that there's a different leader of this Jewish group. So we begin to see this differentiation between the Christians and the Jews, and we also begin to see persecutions picking up against the Christians. And in fact, it's during the reign of Nero, around 64 AD, that the first definite persecutions against the Christians start. And some of the Roman stories are that Nero blames the Christians for this great fire that burns down about a third of Rome. Probably Nero started it, but he blamed the Christians for it. And what that tells us is that the Christians were already a recognized group, and that there was a lot of suspicion about them, because then people were willing to believe the worst. They already didn't like them, and they were willing to allow the Christians to be scapegoats. Okay, so persecution is starting to pick up against Christians during the reign of Claudius and Nero, during the time that Paul is writing this letter of the Galatians. And we also begin to see that Christianity begins to be distinguished from Judaism during this time. So is that clear? Are there any questions that we have about sort of this historical context, the broader Roman context? It may be more than any of y'all care about, but let me know. I'll sit here for a second and see if y'all have any questions, if you want to send them to me. Everyone good? Okay. Then let's go on. Let's go back. And as I said, Rachel said you can't see my screen all that well. But I will talk through this. I'll just show you my PowerPoint text, and then I'll post this afterwards on the Facebook page, okay? So as we said, Galatians is written sometime during this Roman Empire that I talked about from 48 to 55 AD. It's written during the end of the reign of Claudius and the beginning of the reign of Nero. Okay, is the time period that this covers. Another very important, if you can see that on my PowerPoint, you see that word apostolic council. Okay, you see that word apostolic council. And in fact, if you flip from Galatians back to Acts 15, you will find the discussion of this apostolic council. And this is a really important moment in the early church, the apostolic council. And we know that Galatians, one of the reasons we can date Galatians so clearly is because of its connection to the apostolic council in Acts 15. And we're going to talk more about the apostolic council when we get to Galatians 2. When we start talking a little bit about Peter. But just to give you some basic background to the Apostolic Council, it is the first what we consider to be ecumenical or the large Christian council that takes place in Jerusalem. It takes place in 49 to 50 AD. It is presided over by the leader of the church in Jerusalem, who is none other than Jesus's brother James, also the author of the book of James. Okay, and it is deciding this really important question, which I told you that we know by the time of Nero, there is already recognition on the outside that Christians are different from the Jews. Well, this is actually a distinction that Christians themselves start to have to make. And in fact, if they start among the Jewish people, everyone in the early part of Christianity, they're all Jews. But then what Jesus does is Jesus then he breaks, no longer, in order to be recognized as a Jew during the Old Testament, you had to follow the Judaic law. You had to be, all of the men had to be circumcised. You had to follow the prescriptions. You had to follow the teachings of the law, right? Well, we know when Jesus dies, the curtain that separates the inner sanctuary, the inner part of the temple that has where God dwelled, the curtain that separated that from the rest of the temple is torn in half. And this is a very symbolic, a very clear that Jesus now made God accessible to all of us. We no longer have to go through the priest. We no longer have to go through the Judaic rituals. We no longer have to be circumcised. That Jesus is here for all of us. And so this was a really huge marker. But you can also imagine that the Jewish people suddenly are being told that, yes, you were God's people, you are still God's people, but now everyone can be God's people. You are no longer special, so to speak. And this causes a lot of controversy among the early Jews. And in fact, what we know begins to happen is that a lot of early Jewish believers, they believe in who Jesus is, they accept who Jesus is, but they don't like being told that it no longer matters if you're a Jew or not. And in fact, they wanted to give special distinctions to people who were Jews. They wanted the Jews to be the ones who were the leaders. They wanted the people who were circumcised to be the ones who had the most prominence. And in fact, they started to tell Gentiles that in order that, yes, Jesus, you have to believe in who Jesus is, but that's not enough, okay? That you believe in who Jesus is, but then you also have to be circumcised. Then you also have to follow all of the food rituals of the Jews in order to truly be a Christian. They add to the gospel. Okay, this is really, really important. And the council in Acts 15 deals with this issue. And essentially, it's all the early Christian leaders getting together and saying, and the question is Jesus enough? is all it means to follow God and to be a believer is to believe in the death, the resurrection of Jesus, and to believe that by believing in him, that Jesus died and covers all of our sins. Is that enough? And this early church council said yes, mostly. I'm going to qualify that a little bit. They said yes. You do not have to be circumcised in order to be a believer. Jesus is enough, okay? Although we still encourage you to follow the food rituals and purity things, etc. So they still have a little bit of that in there, but ultimately they say Jesus is enough. That was the Council of Acts 15. And one of the major players in the Council of Acts 15 is the guy writing the letter of Galatians. It's Paul. And in fact, this is sort of Paul's big entry into the early church, okay? And we're going to talk a little bit more about who Paul is next week. We don't have time to do it all now, but we'll talk a little bit more about who Paul is. But his sort of big entry into the world of early Christianity is over this issue of is Jesus is enough. And Paul in Galatians comes down, and in fact, one of my favorite Bible teachers and commentators is a guy named Scott McKnight, and he's written a really good commentary on Galatians. And he says that Galatians is one of Paul's most emotional letters, where Paul is, Paul's a fiery person anyway, but Paul gets in here, he comes in charging, I suppose, and think this is his first entry really into the early church, and he comes in charging. And in fact, if we go back to the text, if you go back to the letter of Galatians, we already read the first 5 verses where Paul says, this is who I am, and I'm talking to the churches in Galatia, okay? But then if we go, let's read verses 6 through 10, and let's just see, this is what he says. He says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is any other gospel, but there are some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. As we have said before, so now I repeat, if anyone proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what you have received, let that one be accused. Am I now seeking human approval or God's approval, or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. Okay? Emotional language. Paul says, if you are teaching that in order to be a Christian, that not only do you have to believe in Jesus, but you also have to be circumcised, Paul says you are corrupting the gospel. You are making it a different gospel. It is not what Jesus preached. He said, well, Jesus didn't preach, but it is not what Jesus represents. That Jesus, according to Christians, is enough. That's all we need, is belief in who Jesus is. And that is enough to save us. And so Paul says, anything else is not the gospel of Christ. And if you are preaching it, you should be accursed. And he really does. He says, you should be cursed if you are preaching anything different. Okay? So Paul is, as I said, this is Paul's first foray into the early Christian church. He comes in swinging, saying that he is an apostle just like all of the other apostles. He claims equal authority with Peter. And in fact, hey, Sue, how are you? We're in the middle here. I'm talking about the emotional language of Paul, but I'm glad to have you. And we'll post the video too, so if you want to watch the whole thing from the beginning, then you can do that also. So the question in Galatians is this question of should Christianity, sort of the bigger question within Galatians and also in the Council of Acts, the Council in Acts 15, which is the first council of the Christian church. The question is Christianity just a reform movement within Judaism, or is it something new? And Paul says, and the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15 agrees with him, Christianity is something new. which is why it is now accessible to everyone. Okay, so this is very, very important, because what is decided here and what Paul then moves out, and in fact, let me show you, I'll show you my screen again. What we know is that Paul is already, by the time, if you look at this here, this is actually not only the location of Galatia, but what we also see are Paul's missionary journeys. You see Paul's missionary journey in the red there, that first one. You see a second one in the darker blue, and then you see the pink one, which is his third missionary journey, okay? And what we know is that Paul, almost as soon as he converts to Christianity, starts spreading the gospel. And he's not just taking it to the Jews, he's taking it to everyone throughout the Roman Empire, including all of those people in Galatia, as well as throughout the whole entire Anatolian Peninsula, and even on to Rome, okay? So this question, so Paul is essentially, he's saying, the story that we are taking is we are not just trying to make people into Jewish people. We are trying to bring people the gospel of Jesus and tell them that that all that is needed is their belief in who Jesus is, and that this changes everything. Okay. So are there any questions there? So we sort of have outlined, and my goal for today was sort of to outline the historical context of Galatians, where it is coming from, where it is located in time, where it is located in place. And so it's located in time between 48 and 54 AD of the first century. Probably the letter is written around 48, 49 is probably when the letter is written, okay? We know it takes place within the context of the council of the first council, the Council of Jerusalem, which is the first council in the Christian church, which is also talked about in Acts 15. We know it has taken place during the Roman Empire, under the reign of Claudius, moving to the reign of Nero, which, as we said, is the first time that Christians start experiencing broad persecution within Rome. So that's its historical context. And then we talked about that the place that, even though all of the major players in early Christianity are still in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem, they are beginning to move out, especially Paul, moving out to the rest of the Roman Empire. And Galatia, yes, Rachel, Paul seems to have done this around 48. So Paul moves into Galatia, before 50. It's sometime, all of this takes place between 48 and 54. So there is a lot of conversation, and there's still a little bit of debate about it. But that also is a pretty clear time frame that we know this is taking place. And so we know that Paul has gone to the Galatians before the council in Acts 15. And we know that he has already established some churches there. And so we suspect that this happened between 46 and 48 is probably when this happened. So if that helps you know. We also know Paul goes back to those churches in Galatia and repeats some of those places. So this isn't like sort of his one time where he never goes back to some of these places again. So is that helpful? Yes, Rachel, these are young churches, young Christians. They are mostly not... So what we think is happening, and Rachel's just asked a couple of questions. So I'll go back to my map here of Galatia, and we'll look at that for just a minute with Paul. So what Rachel asked is, are these young Christians? Are these new Christians? And yes, these are. Two things. We know that in Jerusalem, and you ignore the noises, those are my children getting dinner. But what we know is that when the early church, if you think about the first part of Acts, when there was a little bit of dispersal of the early church, where some of the Jews actually ended up having to leave Jerusalem. So we do know that Jewish people have gone out also during this time. But we also know that a lot of the people that are converted in Galatia and a lot of the people that are converted on Paul's missionary journeys are not Jews. They are Gentiles. The people in Galatia are mostly what we call these Celts, who followed very pagan gods. And this is who Paul is converting. And in fact, a lot of Paul's letters are definitely written not to people. A lot of them don't have any familiarity at all with Christianity, with Judaism, or very peripheral knowledge about Jewish people, and in fact a lot of them bring more pagan beliefs to Christianity than they do Jewish beliefs to Christianity. And in fact we see this very clearly in Thessalonians. There are some times where Paul actually quotes back some of the pagan, the non-Christian, non-Jewish things that the pagan culture in Thessalonica is doing, and he says, what are y'all doing? This isn't Christian. This has nothing to do with Christianity. And so we have to realize that these are new Christians. These are people with maybe not very much not very much familiarity with Judaism. And then what happens is after Paul goes on these missionary journeys, what seems to happen is he is followed by some well-meaning Jewish believers, Christians, who are also Jews, who came in behind Paul and started saying, hey, yes, Paul's right. Jesus is good. You need Jesus, but you also need to do these things. And that's where the confusion started. And so these young Christians who don't have as much experience with Judaism are suddenly now told by these other believers that, oh yeah, you got part of it, but you have to do these things too. And so now they're thinking that they have to start practicing circumcision. They have to start practicing Jewish food laws, all of this. And that's where Paul is like, oh my gosh. I mean, you can see him. He says in verse 6, he says, I am astonished that you have so quickly deserted the gospel and you have turned to a different gospel. And in fact, if you look in chapter 3, and one of my favorite things ever, Paul says, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Strong emotional language. The problem is that the people in Galatia had fallen for this lie that Jesus wasn't enough. And so Paul is correcting them. And Paul is also giving a very strong message to these early Jewish leaders, such as James and even Peter. We're going to see there's a standoff between Peter and Paul in Galatians, and Paul wins. But the standoff is also because Peter becomes one of these Judaizers, at least for a little bit. And Paul calls him on it and says, you are wrong. You are preaching a different gospel. Okay, so does that answer your question, Rachel? And I think that's probably a good place to stop for today. It kind of gave us a background, gave us some historical context, talked a little bit about what Paul is trying to do here, and what is the basic, both the Jewish context, the Christian context, and the broader Roman context of what's going on behind Galatians. So I'll watch here for another minute, and let me lay a little bit of the groundwork on what we'll do for next week. My encouragement to you for next week is to read Galatians. I would really encourage you to read. It's not very long. It's only 6 chapters. So maybe read all 6 chapters. But if you don't want to do that, at least read the first chapter for me, okay? Because we'll get into some more context with the first chapter. And next week we'll talk, and Tommy and Rachel, they may bring some help me with this one a little bit too, because they've already done this, but we're going to talk about what it means for Paul to be an apostle, because this is actually really important. So we're going to talk about what it means for Paul to be an apostle next week, and we'll also talk more about the Jerusalem Council, okay, and why that's important. And then we'll spend a lot of time in Galatians chapter 1. There any other questions? I'll sit here and watch it for a minute. Thank y'all for doing this. I hope it was helpful. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So we will post this video so that you can watch it again if you would like. If I confused you with some things, if you have other questions you want to send to me, please do that, and I will try to get them ready for next week. So always feel free to interrupt me with questions, and I encourage you to start reading Galatians. It's a really great book, and it provides a lot of insight into the early church. So, okay, we will talk to you later. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Janie. I'm glad it worked. So it was good to see all of you on, and we will see you again. So bye-bye.